My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Southern Cannibal when I was a child. She'd speak in hushed tones, her eyes darting around the room as if she feared being overheard. It was always just before bedtime, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on us like a physical force. The stories were always shrouded in mystery, but one thing remained constant. The cannibal's existence was a rural legend, whispered about by those who'd grown up around these woods. I remember the first time I heard the phrase, "He comes when the snow falls thick." My grandmother would pause, her eyes locked on mine before continuing. She'd say it was an old folk tale, meant to scare children into behaving. But as I grew older, I began to wonder if there was truth to it. The woods seemed to grow darker and more menacing in winter, as if the very trees themselves were watching me. Years went by, and I'd hear snippets of the legend here and there. A lost hiker found dead in the woods with no signs of trauma. A family reported strange noises on the night before their daughter vanished. But whenever I tried to press my grandmother for more information, she'd change the subject or grow quiet altogether. It wasn't until my sister disappeared that I began to take the legend seriously. She was 22 years old, working as a park ranger in these very woods. We were supposed to meet up at the old cabin on the edge of town for Christmas dinner, but she never showed. The police searched for her, scouring the woods and questioning locals, but there was nothing. No signs of foul play, no indication of what might have happened to her. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, or worse, into something that didn't want to be seen. I grew up hearing the whispers of the Southern Cannibal from a young age. My parents would try to reassure me it was just a myth, but I knew better. The way my grandmother's eyes would gleam when she spoke of him, the way her voice would drop to a whisper, made me believe. As a child, I'd lie awake at night, listening for the creaks and groans of the old house, half expecting the cannibal to come for me. My parents would try to comfort me, but even their words seemed hollow. The darkness outside felt like it was seeping into our home, seeping into my very soul. I remember the first time I saw a photo of him, an old, yellowed picture in a dusty album hidden away in my grandmother's attic. He was a giant, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. My grandmother had told me he was a creature from the swamp, born from the darkness and the mist. According to legend, he'd roam these woods, searching for victims to add to his twisted collection. I began to wonder if I'd be next on his list. Would my parents protect me, or would they become his prey too? The fear consumed me, making it hard to sleep or focus in school. But what really unsettled me was the way my grandmother would smile when talking about him, a slow, sly grin that seemed to hint at some terrible secret. I knew I had to get out of there, but every time I tried to leave, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. It was as if the woods themselves were holding me back, warning me away from the truth. As I grew older, I began to hear the whispers about the Southern Cannibal from other people. They'd share stories of strange occurrences and unexplained events that happened in these woods. A lost hiker found with no signs of trauma. A family who reported hearing eerie whispers on the night before their child went missing. The more I listened, the more I realized that the legend had grown. People were starting to believe it was true. I remember one summer evening when I was 16, our group of friends decided to have a campfire in these very woods. We'd heard the stories, but we didn't think much of them, just another rural legend to scare kids into behaving. As the night wore on and the fire crackled, someone started telling a story about the Southern Cannibal. I tried to tune it out, but my friends were all too enthralled. They laughed and joked, but their eyes kept darting towards the woods as if they expected something to jump out at us. I felt a shiver run down my spine as our friend finished the story, a chilling tale of how the cannibal had taken one of our ancestors. The fire crackled, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking just beyond the ring of light, but there was no one. Yet I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, a soft, raspy voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. It sent chills down my spine, and for the first time I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the legend was true. I was at a friend's birthday party when we decided to take a group trip to the old cabin on the edge of town. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, but little did I know that it would become a nightmare. We arrived at the cabin around 3 p.m., and everyone was excited to explore the woods. My sister, Emily, had been going on and on about her favorite hiking trails in these woods, so we decided to take a group hike. The sun was shining and the birds were singing. It was a perfect day. We hiked for hours, taking breaks and laughing, but as the sun began to set, I noticed that Emily seemed off. She was quieter than usual and her eyes had a distant look in them. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but as we made our way back to the cabin, I realized that she wasn't following us. I turned around, thinking maybe she'd gotten lost, but she was nowhere to be seen. We called out for her, but there was only silence. It was like she had vanished into thin air. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The others were starting to get spooked too, and we all agreed that we should go back out to look for her. We combed the woods, calling out her name, but there was no sign of Emily. It was as if she had been swallowed up by the trees themselves. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I'd lost something precious. As a sibling, I knew how close we were, and now she was gone. I spent the rest of the night searching for her, scouring the woods until my eyes blurred from exhaustion. But as the hours ticked by, the only thing I found was an eerie silence and the feeling that I was being watched. As winter descended upon our rural town, the woods seemed to grow darker and more menacing. The cypress trees towered above us like skeletal fingers, their branches etched against the gray sky like a macabre pen and ink drawing. It was as if the very fabric of reality had grown thick with mist and fog, making it impossible to distinguish what was real from what was just my imagination. I remember walking through the woods one morning, the air crisp and cold, when I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin deep in the heart of the forest. The door creaked ominously in the wind, beckoning me inside. Something about the place seemed off, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I pushed open the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped into a world that felt both familiar and yet utterly alien. The cabin was musty and decaying, with cobwebs hanging from the rafters like ghostly fingers. But what caught my attention was the single, flickering candle on the table, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease as I approached the candle, as if something was watching me from just beyond the edge of perception. Suddenly, the flame danced and spat, casting a malevolent glow over everything. It was then that I knew I had to get out fast. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my sister's name etched into the wall, in letters that seemed to pulse with a dark, otherworldly energy. I spun around, but she was nowhere to be seen. The cabin was empty, except for one thing: a small piece of paper on the table with a single word scrawled on it: "Wait." As I stood there, frozen in terror, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was a soft, raspy voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You'll never leave." The words seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing off the walls of the cabin like a malignant mantra. I tried to run, but my feet felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot. The voice laughed, a low, menacing sound that seemed to crawl under my skin. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. And then everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and sterile white walls. I had no idea how I got there or what had happened during those few formless hours. But as I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed, I heard it again, the voice, whispering in my ear. "You'll never leave." I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a dream or a hallucination brought on by the trauma. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something sinister. And then I saw her, my sister, Emily, sitting in a chair beside my bed, her eyes black as coal and her skin deathly pale. She didn't smile or speak, but just kept staring at me with an unblinking gaze that made my blood run cold. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. And then everything went dark once more. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The voice in my head continued to whisper ominous warnings, and I felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. I tried to sleep, but every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to the sound of my own screams. It was as if my subconscious was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't quite decipher the message. One night, I had a dream that felt all too real. I found myself back in those woods, walking towards the old cabin where Emily went missing. The trees seemed to twist and writhe around me like living things, and the air was thick with an eerie, unnatural silence. As I approached the cabin, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was my sister, but her eyes were black as coal, and her skin was stretched tight over her skull. She beckoned me inside, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I was being pulled towards some dark and ancient ritual. I tried to run, but my feet felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot. And then everything went black again. When I woke up, I felt like I'd been branded with a hot iron. The voice in my head whispered one final message: "They're coming for you." I knew then that I had to get out of town to escape the darkness that seemed to be closing in around me. But as I packed my bags and prepared to leave, I heard a faint scratching sound at my door. It was a soft, tentative scratch, as if someone was trying to tell me something. And then I saw it, a small piece of paper on the floor, with a single word scrawled on it in red ink: "Wait." As I stood there, frozen in terror, I heard a faint scratching sound at my door. It was a soft, tentative scratch, as if someone was trying to tell me something. And then I saw it, a small piece of paper on the floor, with a single word scrawled on it in red ink: "Wait." I knew then that I had to get out of town to escape the darkness that seemed to be closing in around me. But as I packed my bags and prepared to leave, I heard a faint whispering sound coming from outside. It was a soft, raspy voice, and it seemed to be saying something over and over again: "You can't leave. You have to stay." I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something sinister. And then I saw her, Emily's face, staring back at me from the window of my car. Her eyes were black as coal, and her skin was deathly pale. She didn't smile or speak, but just kept staring at me with an unblinking gaze that made my blood run cold. I tried to drive away, but the engine wouldn't start. It was as if something had jammed it, refusing to let me leave. And then I heard the voice again: "You're trapped." The darkness closed in around me, and I knew I was at its mercy. I was alone, with no one to turn to. And then everything went black. I was driving down a winding country road, the only sound being the hum of my engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was late at night, and the stars were shining brightly overhead. I had been driving for hours, trying to escape the feeling of unease that had been building up inside me. But as I rounded a particularly sharp curve, I saw her standing on the side of the road, her back to me. She was dressed in a long black coat that seemed to swallow her whole, and her hair was blowing in the wind like a dark, wild mane. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing with excitement and fear. As I pulled over to the side of the road, she slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were black as coal, and they seemed to bore into my very soul. I felt a chill run down my spine as she smiled at me, a slow, cruel smile that seemed to say, "I've been waiting for you." She began to walk towards me, her long strides eating up the distance between us. As she got closer, I could see that she was carrying something in her hand, a small, leather-bound book. It was adorned with strange symbols and markings that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. She held it out to me, her eyes glinting with an otherworldly light. "Take it," she said, her voice low and husky. "It's been waiting for you." I hesitated for a moment, feeling a sense of trepidation wash over me, but something about her words seemed to draw me in, like a moth to a flame. I took the book from her hand, feeling its strange power coursing through my veins. As I did, I felt a sudden jolt of electricity, as if I had been awakened to a new reality. And then everything went black. As I held the book in my hands, I felt a sense of wonder and excitement. The symbols etched into its cover seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and I could feel the power emanating from it like a palpable force. But as I began to read the words inside, I realized that something was off. The language was ancient and forbidden, and the concepts presented were so twisted and depraved that I felt my mind reeling in protest. And yet, I couldn't stop reading. I had to know more about this book and what secrets it held. As I delved deeper into its pages, I began to feel a creeping sense of madness taking hold of me. The words seemed to shift and writhe on the page like living things, and I could feel my grip on reality beginning to slip. I started to see visions of strange and terrifying creatures lurking in the shadows, watching me with cold, calculating eyes. And then I heard the whispers, a constant, maddening chorus of voices that seemed to come from all directions at once. They were urging me on, pushing me deeper into the heart of madness. I knew I had to stop reading, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the page. The words seemed to be burning themselves into my brain, driving me further and further down the path of destruction. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of my car, the book still clutched in my hand. But something was wrong. The world outside seemed different, twisted and distorted like a funhouse mirror reflection. And then I saw her standing in front of me, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly light. "You should have stopped reading," she said, her voice low and husky. "Now you'll never escape." As I watched, she reached out a bony finger and touched my forehead. The world around me seemed to slow down, as if time itself was bending to accommodate her presence. I felt myself being drawn into a vortex of darkness, where the past and present collided like two titans in combat. Memories long buried began to surface, memories that I had thought were lost forever. I saw my childhood, my family, my friends, all of it flooding back like a tidal wave. But it was not just memories that came flooding back. I also saw moments from my past that I had never wanted to remember. The accidents, the arguments, the heartbreaks, they all came rushing back, like a litany of horrors that I couldn't escape. And through it all, she watched me with an unblinking gaze, her eyes burning with a malevolent intensity. She was a creature from another time, a being who had been frozen in perpetuity by some ancient and forgotten curse. And now, she had thought out to torment me with the memories of my past. I felt myself being pulled apart like a thread being torn from a tapestry. My mind was shattered, my very sanity hanging in the balance. And still, she watched on, her eyes glinting with a sadistic pleasure. She was a monster, a creature without heart or compassion. And yet, there was something else, something that made me feel a twisted sense of kinship with this ancient being. A sense of shared understanding, perhaps. A sense of belonging to some dark and hidden world, beyond the reaches of mortal men. As I stood there, frozen in terror, the darkness around me seemed to coalesce into a palpable presence. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, revealing a void so vast and profound that it defied comprehension. The air was heavy with an otherworldly energy, like the whispers of 1,000 midnights converging on a single point. I felt my mind straining to contain the horror that was unfolding before me, but it was like trying to grasp a handful of sand. The harder I squeezed, the more it slipped through my fingers. The darkness began to take shape, coalescing into twisted, eldritch forms that seemed to writhe and twist in ways that defied the laws of nature. They were creatures born from the very void itself, their bodies composed of writhing tendrils and bulging, pulsing orbs that seemed to draw the light out of the air like a dark, malevolent sun. And at the heart of it all, I saw her, the being who had unleashed this horror upon me. Her eyes blazed with an infernal light, as if she were the very embodiment of the darkness itself. She reached out a bony hand and touched my forehead, and suddenly I was flooded with visions of the cosmos in chaos, stars exploding like supernovas, galaxies unraveling like threads from a tapestry, and the fabric of reality tearing apart like paper in a hurricane. The sheer scale of it was almost too much to comprehend, and I felt my mind reeling under the onslaught. And then, everything went black.